Hi, I'm Melissa.
And I'm Bella.
And this is the Book Break. And today we have a very exciting special guest. You, I am sure, have heard of her before, the Wings of Fire author, Tui T. Sutherland. And we're going to bring her right in.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Tui. Thank you so much for being here with us. So you have a book that just came out this fall, winter season that is so beautiful and fun. It's A Guide to the Dragon World, which we're super pumped about. Tell us a little bit more about this incredibly beautiful book.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying that. I always feel like I should start by giving a shout out to the artist. Her name is Joy Ang, and she has done the covers for all of the books. And then she did a bunch of new art for this one, which is one of the reasons it's so beautiful. And the other reason is our designer. His name is Phil, and he works at Scholastic, and he spent so much time on this book, like making it as beautiful as it is, like all the different colors of the pages and the borders. And I love it too. Like I just like want to look at it all day long. Yeah, it is pretty exciting to see how it turned out.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I love about it, in addition to all of the beautiful artwork, which we can, bring up some of this really cool artwork, but it gives us lots of different descriptions of our different dragon types and things like that. So you can also see there's maps in this, and it's just so fun. I'm curious, what was your process in putting this book together as opposed to the difference of writing the novels?
Yeah, it was very different. For some reason, I thought this would be really easy because I was like, oh, I'll just take all of the like little notes that I've written about each of these different tribes and just like throw them into a book. But once I got started, I realized I couldn't just do sort of an encyclopedia the way I was picturing it, because I love characters so much and I love stories so much that what I really wanted to do was have it be sort of a story within the world. So basically I started thinking, like, what if it's a dragon that we know, his name is Starflight, and he's the one who's putting this book together because he's a librarian now. He's a librarian at a school for dragons. And what he has noticed, like as this librarian, is that most of the books that he grew up reading were only written by two particular tribes. They were either by Nightwings or they were by Seawings. And so as a result, there's a lot of misinformation about these other kinds of tribes that haven't gotten to tell their own stories before. And so he says, well, what if we make a real guide to the dragon world that gets the voices of those dragons to tell their side of the story? And so he sort of sends his friends out on like a little mini quest where he's like, okay, go to the Ice Wings and ask them for a story that tells us more about what it really is like to be an Ice Wing. Go to the Rain Wings and like have them actually write a story of their own. It's a Rain Wing character that actually hasn't had her own book yet, but people are always asking for one. Her name is Kinkajou. So they like take like a school assignment she's written.
I love Kinkajou.
Kinkajou is so much fun to write, and it was especially exciting to do sort of her own, like what she would be writing as, because she's such an over-the-top, like bubbly character, and there's just like the whole story is like a bunch of asides and all of the thoughts that she's having as she's writing the story. So that was really, really fun to get to sort of figure out for her.
Yeah, that is so fun.
Yeah, so hopefully the idea is like as you're reading the book, you're like, oh, this is what Mudwings are really like, and this is like Sandwings telling what is actually happening to them. And it I feel like all books are for building empathy, and librarians are for giving children those tools, and this is sort of bringing all of that together in the context of the dragon world.
Yeah. And I mean, I totally loved it. And one other thing that I love about the Wings of Fire series is it's so big. And I think that's really fun. And so one of the things about it being big is like you have tons of fans, which is one of the reasons why we have Bella here with us today as a guest co-host, because she is a big fan and she's representing the younger audience. And so we've got some questions from your younger fans, and I'm going to let Bella jump in with the question.
All right. One of the questions here is actually one of my own. Sorry, other fans. How long was the idea of Wings of Fire in your head before you first put the first book on paper?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because I feel like a lot of stories like are always sort of like turning around in my head. Like there's several that have been in there for a long time that we'll see if I ever get to them. With Wings of Fire, I think you know, I'd always loved dragons, so there's always been a part of me that was like, well, what would my own dragon story be like? I think for the beginning of it, I had an idea for the 5 books that would start off the series, and outlining that probably took me like a year, because I was thinking about, I had to figure out the world and like the different kinds of dragons I wanted. I needed to know what the prophecy was going to be like, and I rewrote that prophecy several times. And then just figuring out the characters, which was the most important part, like who was going to get each of those 5 books and what was their arc going to be, and how would it connect to like the bigger themes that I was interested in, like fate and free will and destiny and all of that. Kind of coming together in these characters. So I'd say probably the outlining took like a year, and then actually writing it was between 6 months and a year.
That's awesome. Well, and you know, it's fun because I love that you just mentioned the outlining is what took you a while to begin with, because so many authors have different writing styles, and you already answered one of my questions. You know, we talk about, are you an outliner or are you a pantser? Meaning, do you do the outlines or do you write by the seat of your pants?
Okay, wait, but I'm actually a pantser. So when I say I'm totally a pantser. But it's very hard to write like a long series as someone who writes, just like I like to figure it out as I go. So the outlining, when I talk about the outline, what I was actually mostly doing was figuring out the backstory of the world. I think the other analogy that I really like is like architects versus gardeners. And so like I think of myself as a gardener, so I spend a lot of time on like getting it ready. Like, what's the backstory? Like, what's the history? What's the setting? Like, what happened to these characters before we met them? So that when like the story starts to grow, even though I don't know exactly what's going to come up, like I've laid a lot of the groundwork for it. But I like to figure out a lot of it as it goes along, like plot developments, all the twists. I really like to find that out as it's happening, because I feel like if I know too much ahead of time, then I'll telegraph it in the story somehow. So like, for instance, in the first book, there's like 3 queens, and any one of them, like they're fighting over this throne. And I was like, okay, I'll just make them all terrible so that so no one will be able to guess who's going to end up queen. And then I got to book 5 and I was like, oh no, all my choices are terrible. None of them should be queen. What am I going to do? And so I had to figure it out like as I got to that book.
That's awesome.
All right. From Titan of the 6th grade, where did you get your idea for Wings of Fire, and what inspired you to write the series?
Well, it was a few things. One of them is just that I love dragons. I've always loved them. I was a huge Anne McCaffrey fan when I was a kid. And the idea of like having a little dragon or riding a dragon, and then later, you know, maybe the idea of being a dragon was something that it was hard. You know, I always thinking about that kind of thing. I find them really cool, and writing about them feels like writing about regular teenagers, but they all have a little bit of a superpower. Like they all can fly, and like some of them can breathe fire. So it's kind of like taking human stories and then making them just a little more exciting. Like all kinds of things can happen to dragons. And with beginning the series in particular, I wanted to take some of what we know about like epic fantasy and flip it around a little bit. So like, for instance, the idea of like seeing what's going on from a dragon's point of view instead of a human's, but also the idea of a prophecy that says like, this is what your life has to be. And I wanted to take these characters and put them in that situation and say, well, what if you don't want to fulfill the prophecy? Or, you know, how do they each react to it? What if you feel like you could save the world, but you want to do it your own way? Or what if you're just not interested in saving the world at all? Do you still have to just because you're in a prophecy? So it was a lot about that. It was like thinking about fate and free will and destiny and the prophecies and like what would happen to all these little dragons and how they would each react differently to it. That was sort of what I was thinking about as I got started on the book.
That's awesome. Well, and you know what? I'm going to actually ask you a question too from another kiddo. This is from Mason in 6th grade, and he wants to know, and I want to know this too. So I'm going to say maybe it's my question too. We want to know, are there going to be any more novels coming again soon?
Yes, I can say yes to both of you.
Okay.
Yes, my plan is to write more novels. After book 15, I was like, okay, this is a good place to pause and write some of those other ideas that I've always had like in my head. So I've actually finished another book that's totally unrelated to Wings of Fire. It's a graphic novel. So that's probably going to take a while to come out because we have to find an artist and make all of that happen. And I have another book that's also totally unrelated. It's science fiction that I may eventually, hopefully, get to finish. But I can't stop thinking about the dragons and, going on tour and getting to talk to all the kids and finding out what they still wanted to know and which characters they wanted to see again gave me all of these ideas. And now I'm really excited to get back and get to hopefully, there are things like I want to get to Teenage Bumblebee. I feel like Teenage Bumblebee would be a hilarious character to write.
Yeah, for sure.
And then I want to tell you what happened to Umber, who's a character that disappeared at the end of book 6. I have just like lots of little things that I'm like, well, I can't be done because, I need to answer these questions for myself and for everybody else.
That's awesome.
All right. Cohen of the 7th grade asks, what gave you the idea for Animus Dragons?
That's a great question because it's sort of a funny story. I knew going in that writing about dragons that they would have a lot of sort of dragony powers. I was going to, there would obviously be fire breathing. There would also be ice breathing, the venom and all of that. But I didn't have like a specific idea for magic until I was writing book 1. And this is one of those like pantser kinds of ideas. And the dragons, these 2 little dragons are walking along like in a cave and they find like the entrance to their prison and they're trying to get in because they've managed to sneak out and they're coming around to rescue their friends. And I was like, well, okay, it's a boulder, like in a tunnel in a cave. Like why would it be locked? Like, how could I lock it? Like, what would it be like? And so I had the dragons have that conversation. They're like, what's the mechanism that's kept us trapped in here? Is it something mechanical? And then one of them, as I was writing it, one of the characters sort of popped into my head and was like, well, what if it's magic? And I was like, what kind of magic? And so I feel like that happens a lot where I have like a mini conversation with my characters and they help me figure out what's going to happen. And so this character was like, well, what if there's a kind of magic in this world that only works on objects? And so it's a little more specific than what you maybe think of as magic in general. And so, let's call it animus magic. And only very few dragons have it. So in the conversation, they're like, oh, it's extremely rare. Like you never meet an animus dragon. And I was like, okay, I'll just like put that in my back pocket for later. And then in book 2, I was like, ooh, I could use an animus dragon in my murder mystery. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to make an animus dragon. And then my book 10, I was like, now there are 400 animus dragons. It's like, there's just a lot. The animus magic kind of went bananas for a little while because it's just so much fun to write about. Like, what is it like to have that kind of power? What does it do to a dragon? To actually like be able to do that kind of thing with their powers and with that kind of magic. So that was sort of how it started though.
Yeah, that is so fun. Okay, so this last question is one that is coming from Katie in 3rd grade. And honestly, I think from all your fans, what is your favorite dragon type?
Oh, well, I always think about which dragon would I want to be, right? Like which tribe would I want to be in? And I think the answer is usually Rainwings. Because right, because they like to sleep a lot, which I do too. I definitely want a pet sloth, which a lot of the Rainwings have, and they're very peaceful, kind of like chill dragons. I don't think I'd be a very good Icewing. I don't think I'd be a very good Skywing, but I love writing about them because getting to try and see the world from their perspective is always different. Whereas with Rainwings, I'm like, yeah, it's nap time. I relate to that very much.
Oh, that is so fun. Bella and I were talking about that right before we started talking to you, and we both said Rainwings as well.
Oh, that's awesome. So, you know what? I had someone on tour point out though that the Rainwings don't have a lot of books at the beginning of the series. Like they're not big readers, and that's one big difference between me and them. I'm like, I'd have to be a Rainwing who like has a secret library.
Yeah, I agree with you. Oh, that's so fun. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today, Tui. And we're going to bring up your website. And so people can also find you on Instagram as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's where I post the art that I get at events.
Oh, so awesome. Well, thank you again for being with us. And thank you to our viewers. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.